I'm Ritika Gupta in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. World leaders gather in Kyiv, pledging more aid for Ukraine 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. The French president meets with US President Donald Trump to discuss Ukraine, saying neither country wants a peace deal that is fragile. The United Nations adopts a resolution calling on the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, with the US voting no on it. Welcome to World News America. I'm Ritika Gupta, where the rift between the US and its allies over the war in Ukraine appears to be widening as Ukraine marks the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. France's President Emmanuel Macron is here in Washington, making Europe's case to his US counterpart, Donald Trump. The two put on a cordial display, talking fondly about their country's relationship and the strength of their alliance. But not far away at the United Nations in New York, the US was at loggerheads, not just with France, but with the rest of its European allies. The US voted against a European resolution calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, along with Russian allies, including North Korea and Belarus. The US put forward its own resolution that didn't mention Russia's aggression at all, only to abstain from voting on it after European members added language that was critical of Russia. At the White House earlier, reporters asked Mr. Trump about that move.
Can you explain the rationale in having the U.S. vote against the UN resolutions that Ukraine proposed and also the U.S. proposed?
I would rather not explain it now, but it's sort of self-evident, I think.
Mr. President, first talked about increasing...
But after their talks, Mr. Macron told a news conference the pair had made good progress, and he said he and Mr. Trump were aligned on their core aim.
Il veut la paix. We want peace, he wants peace. We want peace swiftly, but we don't want an agreement that is weak. The fact that there are Europeans that are ready to engage to provide for these security guarantees, and now there's a clear American message that the U.S. as an ally is ready to provide that solidarity for that approach, that's a turning point in my view.
And our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, was in the room for that news conference. So welcome. What did Macron want to achieve in these talks with Trump, and do you think he was successful?
Well, look, Emmanuel Macron's the first European leader that President Trump has hosted since he was re-elected. And whilst it was all very chummy, you know, they were hugging each other and lavishing praise on one another to try and show that they have built up this friendship for quite a number of years. Mr. Trump even referring to him as my friend when the press conference started. The fact is, Mr. Macron came here with an agenda, and he wanted to make sure that Europe and Ukraine are at the centre of any kind of peace deal, because they were sidelined following those talks in Saudi Arabia. Did Mr. Macron get what he wants? I'm not sure. During that press conference, he answered in a very long answers, but he kept coming back to this point about how there needs to be security assurances for Ukraine. Mr. Trump never said that once, and instead he said Europe needs to do the heavy lifting when it comes to coming up with a peace deal. If Mr. Trump wanted to soften his tone on Ukraine and harden it on Russia, he did not seek to do that in this press conference.
So, Nomia, I was just going to mention about the security guarantees, the fact that Macron kept mentioning those. So do you feel that there was some kind of resolution between the US and the EU with Macron there, or do you think that divide is just getting bigger?
It's difficult to say, because on the one hand you have Mr. Macron wanting these guarantees from Donald Trump, and as I said in the press conference, you know, he had an opportunity to sort of agree with that, but he didn't. Mr. Trump wants peace, and he wants the war to end. They both do, actually, Mr. Macron and Mr. Trump, but they both have different views on how to get there. And I think with this UN resolution that's been introduced, in which the US has extraordinarily sided with North Korea, Belarus and Russia instead of its usual democratic allies, sort of tells you exactly where the US is positioned on this. Mr. Trump did say something interesting today. He said that Vladimir Putin has said that he will accept peacekeepers in Ukraine, but Mr. Putin Putin, we understand, has said that he's not had any conversation with Donald Trump. So in conclusion, did Mr. Macron get what he wanted? Not entirely sure. But of course, Mr. Trump has yet to meet another key European leader this week when the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, visits the White House.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, for keeping us across that story. Well, as they mark the third anniversary of Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion, some of Ukraine's allies are promising billions of dollars worth of additional military and financial support. Leaders from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Spain and Canada met with President Volodymyr Zelensky alongside EU chief Ursula von der Leyen at a summit in Kyiv, hoping to show their solidarity with Ukraine amid increasing hostility from Washington. Mr. Trump and Mr. Macron later joined via video link. The UK also joined those discussions. The country's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is among those stressing that Ukraine must have a seat at the table in peace negotiations. Addressing the summit, he said Mr. Trump had created an opportunity to end the war, but that the West must increase the pressure on Russia even further. Mr. Zelensky said he had a good conversation with the US president during the summit, but gave no further details. He told delegates about his hopes for the months ahead.
This year should be the year of the beginning of a real, lasting peace. Putin will not give us peace or give it to us in exchange for something. We have to win peace through strength and wisdom and unity, through our cooperation.
And our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, has more from the meeting in Kyiv.
Cars destroyed in the fight for Kyiv 3 years ago have been gathered into a memorial in Irpin, the suburb where Ukraine won the battle for its capital. Next to the new bridge, the ruins of the old one between Kyiv and Irpin are also preserved. The Ukrainian army blew the bridge to stop Russian tanks using it. Ukraine's Western allies, just like the Kremlin, expected these men would lose to Russia within days or weeks. Russian shelling was intense. For Ukrainians, it felt like the worst of times. It was a dangerous journey for thousands of civilians who used the rubble as stepping stones to cross the river into relative safety inside Kyiv. But the country rallied when the Americans offered to evacuate President Zelensky. He told them he needed ammunition, not a ride. Zelensky donned military attire and posted videos telling Ukrainians he was staying to lead the fight. But 3 years after they stopped the Russian invaders, marked with a Z from scoring a quick victory, the old Ukrainian nightmare of national extinction is back. Ukraine's modernized army is just about holding its own, here training near their border with the Russian province of Kursk. Their nightmare is Donald Trump. He's put restoring America's relationship with Russia above Ukraine's fight to stay independent. And Trump has repeated Russian lies. Like the claim Ukraine started the war. Edward said Russia started it. They came to our home to kill us. Our sons, our daughters, and our parents. That is why we are fighting. Along the border, Ukrainian troops are getting ready to rejoin the battle in Kursk, a chunk of Russia it seized last August and is fighting to keep. In the bunkers, warm and dry, these men are facing the prospect of losing the American support that has been vital for 3 years. Evhen, a squad leader and a veteran of the war in Kursk, says Ukraine is making more weapons of its own and they will keep going.
It's good to get help from abroad. Help won't last forever. It's here today, it might be gone tomorrow.
Soldiers here know that Putin believes Ukraine belongs to Russia, which is why they're alarmed by talk of Trump making a deal with him.
Putin wants to destroy our political system and to make Ukraine his vassal state.
Are there any circumstances under which Western countries, the Americans, should trust President Putin?
No, I don't have enough fingers to count how many times Putin lied to everyone, to the Russians, and to us, and to the West.
fighting men in a snow-covered forest. It's a scene from Europe's past, and the challenge for leaders, for diplomats, is to make sure it's not a scene from Europe's future, because it might be. The point the Ukrainians make is that if President Putin is able to get what he wants by breaking international law and going to war, then it won't be the last time. Not just for him, but for others. Back in Kyiv 3 years ago, as the barricades went up, it was a straightforward fight for survival. For Ukrainians, it still is, but it is not straightforward. Then, volunteers signed up to fight, talking about protecting their families. Now, that early enthusiasm has gone after huge casualties, and the authorities pursue men who won't fight. Dmytro and Maxim, then 18 and 19, both fought in the battle for Kyiv. Maxim, on the left, served around 30 months in frontline combat. 3 years on, both fear Trump will appease Putin as Britain appeased Nazi Germany before 1939.
It is a very dangerous moment for the entire world, not only for Ukraine. Even if United States will not provide us any more weapons or other support.
I think that Donald Trump wants to become like a new Chamberlain who like signed some treaty with Hitler, and we all know what it was in the result. But I think that Mr. Trump should be more focused on becoming like somebody like Churchill.
3 years ago, you were young guys volunteering for the army. You must have changed.
Everyone changed. And I have changed. I think that every Ukrainian and me in person matured during these 3 years. Everyone who entered military and everyone who was fighting for such a long time drastically changed.
The cost of this war is heavy, but not so unbearable that either side will sue for peace. It's about more than controlling land. It's about existence. For these Ukrainians, independence. Putin's fighting them for Russia's place in the world, and that's why making a peace deal might be impossible. And now, for the Ukrainians and their European partners, the sense that Trump's America isn't just an unreliable ally. It might be no kind of ally at all. At this memorial in Kyiv, every flag commemorates a dead soldier. Ukrainians want peace, but the alternatives to not fighting on look like defeat. In the square next to the memorial is a weekly vigil for men missing in action. The Americans want Ukraine to accept they can't win and make a deal, even if it rewards Putin for invading their country and killing so many people. Ulia Zaitseva's father was posted as missing in Kursk in December. We just want to know what happened to them, she says. We need answers. They don't tell us anything. Every month more go missing, she said. It doesn't end. And it may not, for a long time, whatever Donald Trump wants. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Kyiv.
And with me is Jeremy Shapiro, Research Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you.
I mean, Europe seems quite concerned about Trump's stance on this war. We've heard Trump threaten to pull away support. He's called Zelensky a dictator. He's praised Putin. And Macron's trip to DC, that seemed like an effort to almost rein Trump in, or, you know, try to prevent a rushed Ukraine deal. What do you think his objectives were, and do you think he was successful in them?
Yeah, I think his objectives were to use his personal relationship with Donald Trump essentially to change Donald Trump's mind about Ukraine. You heard him saying, we can't allow Ukraine to surrender, will be a problem for the West. I think that, you know, this is a typical way that Europeans have tried to handle Donald Trump. They've sort of seen him say something that they feel is crazy or misguided, and they say, well, we have to go over and convince him that he's wrong. They've had very little success of that in the past, and I think they won't have much success this time.
And Macron's trip to DC, that comes at a time when the UK and EU have imposed new sanctions on Russia. And this seems in contrast to what's happening in the US, where there is talks of potentially removing or lifting sanctions on Russia. Do you think that is a possibility? And what do you think that means for this growing divide between the US and Europe's response?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's very clear. What we saw in the last week or two is that the US and European position, or at least the position of most of Europe on Ukraine, has very seriously divided. The US is out to get a deal. They don't really care that much what the content of that deal is. Part of that deal will certainly be, because the Russians are asking for it, at least a partial lifting of sanctions in the context of some sort of agreement. It's very unlikely that Europe will be part of that, and I think putting new sanctions on today was to signal that.
And speaking of deals, the minerals deal seems, at the heart of Ukraine's bid to win over the US support. So how much do you think is riding on this deal?
Well, on a certain level, a lot, and on another, more accurate level, nothing. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of money involved, and I think the Ukrainians do see it as a way of cementing the U.S. fealty to their cause. But from what I understand, actually, there's not very much money there to exploit, certainly in the near term. And secondly, I think it's very unlikely to succeed in getting the U.S. to do what they want. Typically, with the Trump administration, if he makes a demand and you satisfy it, there's another demand, and I would expect another demand.
And Trump has said that European leaders need to contribute more to the cost and the security for Ukraine. And European leaders, as we know, meeting in Kyiv, and they pledged to give more support. But can they do it without the US?
They can certainly give more support. Whether they can give sufficient support to sustain Ukraine in the war, I think, is a very difficult and open question. The truth is that from a distant remove, we don't really know precisely what the U.S. contribution is. We know it's bigger than anybody else. We know that they've given all sorts of weapons and arms, but there's an almost intangible intelligence quality to what the U.S. is doing to support Ukraine. And it's not clear at all to me that Europeans can substitute for that. And I think you heard Zelensky say that last week, where he essentially admitted that they can't win this war without the United States.
And one of the big criticisms of the way the US has handled it is in negotiations, taking things off the table with Russia, whether it's to Ukraine's membership of NATO or to Russia giving land back. What is Russia going to give in return? That's been the big question, has it not?
It certainly is. I think if you look at the Riyadh meeting that the Russians had with the Americans last week, you see that what they're thinking about is trading issues outside of Ukraine for American and Ukrainian concessions within Ukraine. So things like the Arctic, things like oil and gas exploration, perhaps even things on Iran and China and North Korea.
And Europe not having a seat at the table, that has been one of the big issues, and a deal being made without Ukraine's presence. I mean, do we have any more insight into what a deal could look like without them being involved, and how this is going to go down from European leaders?
Well, look, I mean, Europeans and Ukrainians will have to be part of the solution, but they don't actually have to be part of the deal. The only way that they can insist that they're part of the deal is if they have assets that they can withhold. And so far, it seems as if that if the Russians and Americans agree on anything, the Europeans and Ukrainians, no matter how much they dislike it, will have to accept it. I think a lot of people don't see it that way, but I think if what you've seen in the last couple of weeks is they don't feel like they have a lot of other options.
And Macron mentioned in his speech a lot about the need for security guarantees for Ukraine. And we didn't seem to get too much of a reaction from Trump on that. I just wanted to get your take on how important that is going to be with these talks between even the US and what Europe wants.
Well, again, I mean, obviously, Ukraine wants security guarantees. I think Trump has been fairly clear, and J.D. Vance even clearer, that there aren't going to be any American security guarantees for Ukraine. Even in the context of the mineral deal, they absolutely refused that. It's been their position that Europe can give whatever security guarantees it wants. Whether that's sufficient for Ukraine to stop fighting is, I suppose, up to them, but I think it gets back to this question of whether they have them or not, can they continue fighting without the United States?
All right, thank you so much. That was Jeremy Shapiro there at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And joining me now is our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. So, Steve, what is the mood like in Russia 3 years into the war?
Goodness me, I mean, what a dramatic 3 years it has been, right? I mean, this started out as a special military operation as far as the Kremlin was concerned. It went badly wrong. The Kremlin had to mobilize people, call up reservists. It had to put down a mutiny by Russian mercenaries who were marching on Moscow. Remember that crazy 24 hours. And so many Russian soldiers have been killed on the battlefield. But we're in this position 3 years on, where Russia feels it has the initiative on the battlefield. Not only that, it feels it has the ear of the President of the United States. It can hear President Trump criticizing President Zelensky, not criticizing Vladimir Putin. We see that talks have begun between the US and Russia, and there's talk of a possible summit soon. So things have turned around completely. So I think there is a confidence here, certainly in Moscow, a confidence born of the fact that they have been gaining territory in eastern Ukraine on the battlefield, and confidence because they see that the kind of things that Donald Trump has been saying and the Trump administration has been saying go down very well in Moscow.
And Russia and US teams are reportedly planning another meeting. So what are the Russians expecting to come from that?
Yes, we don't have a date for that, but what the Russians say is they are continuing to repair bilateral relations. So the talks that are continuing between the US and Russia will focus, as far as the Kremlin is concerned, on rebuilding this relationship between Moscow and Washington, not directly concerned with the war in Ukraine, but of course Ukraine will be mentioned. Interestingly and unexpectedly, Vladimir Putin popped up late tonight on Russian state television. In fact, they interrupted regular programs to bring this, and he said lots of things that would have gone down very well with Donald Trump. There was flattery. He said that President Trump wasn't driven by emotion, but had a rational approach to what was happening. There was praise. He praised Donald Trump's idea for America and Russia and China to slash defense spending, and he came up with offers of big money projects, the idea of economic cooperation between Russia and the United States, for example, in the aluminium industry. So I think the Kremlin leader clearly knows which buttons to press to make an impression, a positive impression, on Donald Trump.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. The United Nations Secretary General voiced alarm at rising violence in the occupied West Bank after Israel's announcement that it is expanding military operations there. Israel expelled residents of 3 refugee camps in the occupied West Bank on Sunday. Defense Minister Israel Katz said the camps in Jenin, Tulkarm and Nur Shams are now empty after residents were evacuated, a move that the UN considers to be the forced displacement of 40,000 people. Katz says that the Israeli military will now prepare for a prolonged presence in those areas over the coming year. The Palestinian Authority condemned the move. It comes as mediators have been trying to solve the latest hurdle in Gaza ceasefire negotiations. On Sunday, Israel ordered an indefinite delay on the release of more than 600 Palestinians in return for 6 living and 4 dead hostages who had already been freed by Hamas, accusing the Palestinian armed group of repeated ceasefire violations, including humiliating handover ceremonies. Hamas says the move puts the ceasefire in grave danger. Indirect negotiations for a second phase of the ceasefire are yet to start. And let's turn to some other important news around the world. The Vatican says there has been a slight improvement in the Pope's condition as he continues to be treated for pneumonia, but he is still in critical condition. The 88-year-old is spending an 11th night in the hospital. People held a prayer in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. Tech giant Apple says they plan to invest more than $500 billion in the US over the next 4 years and create 20,000 jobs. That will start with a new advanced manufacturing factory in Texas set to open next year. The vast majority of new jobs will be in research and development, software and artificial intelligence. And US singer Roberta Flack has passed away. She was one of soul and R&B music's great artists, becoming the first singer to win back-to-back Grammys for Record of the Year. She was best known for her hits in the 1970s, including The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face and Killing Me Softly with his song. In 2022, Flack announced that she had ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Roberta Flack was 88 years old. And I'm Ritika Gupta, and you can keep up to date with all the stories on the website, bbc.com/news, or on the app. Thank you for watching World News America.